The kitchen was the only warm place on the ship. I don't mean that as a metaphor. Though it worked as one too. I mean it literally. The Vatharan Empire ran their vessels the way they ran everything else. Efficiently, coldly, with the kind of precision that made you feel like a rounding error in their calculations. Every corridor on the Vathron's eye was exactly the same temperature. Every surface was the same shade of pale silver. The lighting never changed, because the Vatharans didn't have feelings about lighting. They had data about it. My kitchen was different. The ventilation system down on Deck 9 was 17 years old, and slightly too slow, which meant the heat from the cooking units pooled near the ceiling and drifted down in waves. It smelled like roasted grain and the faint sweetness of whatever fruit I had bruised that morning. It was loud in a way that nothing else on the ship was loud. Not the crashing, urgent loudness of an alarm, but the comfortable noise of water simmering and metal spoons and things being useful. I had been assigned to the Vathron's Eye as a replacement cook after the previous one was transferred to a border station. My briefing was short: feed the crew, approximately 340 Vatharan personnel, 2 other humans, and 1 Marathi liaison who couldn't process sulfur compounds. Don't enter restricted corridors. Don't interact with restricted personnel. The prince was listed as restricted. I didn't think much about him at first. I had heard the talk, of course. Everyone on the ship had. Prince Valith, Crown Prince of the Vatharan Empire, heir to 11 star systems and 1 extremely complicated political inheritance, was somewhere on this ship failing to become what everyone needed him to be. The Emperor had sent tutors, the kind of tutors who had titles that took longer to say than most people's entire names. Archtutor Savan, who had educated 3 governors and 1 senator. Linguist scholar Preth, who spoke 41 languages, including 2 that were technically dead. Cultural immersion specialist Orath, who had a method so celebrated that it had been written into the Imperial Educational Charter. None of them, apparently, could reach him. I heard this the way you hear weather reports about places you're not going. Interesting, maybe. Not my problem. My problem, that first week, was the root vegetables. Vatharan root vegetables are dense, fibrous, and deeply unforgiving. They look like something that gave up halfway through becoming a potato and decided to become a rock instead. The previous cook had apparently dealt with this by boiling them for so long that they dissolved into a kind of pale mash that I was told the crew ate without complaint. I tasted it once. It tasted like warm nothing. I started roasting them instead, with oil and a spice blend I had been developing since my 2nd day, and on the 4th day, there was a small, quiet riot in the meal line because a junior engineer took 3 portions and a senior officer only got 1. I considered this a good start. It was the 5th night when I first saw Valith. I was up at what the ship's clock called 0300, which was neither day nor night, but that specific dark hour that belongs to people who can't sleep, and bread that needs watching. I had a batch of Vatharan grain loaves proving on the 2nd counter. They needed another 20 minutes before they went into the heat unit. And I was sitting on an overturned stockpot drinking something the ship's supply system called coffee, but which had clearly never met a coffee bean personally. He was just standing at the entrance. He was small for a Vatharan. They tend toward height, long-limbed and angular, with the kind of posture that suggests they were built by someone who took structural engineering very seriously. But he was young, maybe 12 in human years, or 16 in Vatharan developmental stages, and he had that particular quality that children have when they are trying to look like they aren't lost. He wasn't wearing his formal sash, his secondary eyes. Vatharans have a pair of smaller, light-sensitive eyes just above the primary set, were open wider than usual, which I later learned was what happened when a Vatharan was uncertain but trying not to show it. I didn't bow. I had been told I was supposed to bow to the prince, but I was also in the middle of something, and I have never been very good at remembering protocol when I have bread proving. I said, "You want some of this terrible coffee, or are you just here to stand in my doorway?" He blinked. Both sets of eyes. "I do not drink stimulant compounds," he said. His voice was precise in the way that Vatharan voices always were, like each word had been selected after careful consideration of all the alternatives. "Fair enough," I said. "You can come in anyway." He came in. He stood near the 2nd counter and looked at the loaves the way you look at something you don't have a category for yet. After a minute he said, "Why do you make them in the early hours?" "Because bread is slow," I said. It doesn't care what time it is. You have to work around it. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "That is inefficient." "Yes," I agreed. "It also tastes better." He stayed for 40 minutes, watching me work and saying almost nothing. When the loaves came out of the heat unit, I cut one open and put a piece in front of him without asking. He looked at it, then he ate it. He didn't say anything about it, but he picked up the second piece himself, which I counted as a review. He came back the next night, and the night after that. I never asked him why. I never told anyone he was there. I just let him exist in my kitchen the way the warmth existed, without asking it to justify itself. On the 9th night, I gave him a piece of dough and told him to knead it. "You look like you need something to push against," I said. He didn't argue. He started kneading, badly at first, then with the focused intensity that I would come to recognize as his default mode for anything he decided to take seriously. His hands were stronger than I expected. We worked side by side for a while in the comfortable noise of the kitchen, and it occurred to me that this was probably the first time in his life that anyone had handed him a task with no grade attached to it. I was summoned to see Archtutor Sivan 3 days later. He was a tall, composed Vetharan, with the kind of expression that suggested he had opinions about everything and patience for very little. He told me, in the precise way that high-ranking Vetharans delivered uncomfortable information, that the prince had been observed visiting my section of the ship on multiple occasions, that this was irregular, that it raised concerns about the educational environment, and that he expected it to stop. I asked him to explain what methods the tutors had tried. He looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that has asked an unexpected question. Then, perhaps because he was more curious than insulted, he answered. Cognitive immersion sessions, structured philosophical dialogue, behavioral modeling, legacy projection, which was apparently a Vetharan method where you showed a child the achievements of their ancestors and connected it to their own developmental targets. Historical analysis, strategic simulation. I asked if anyone had ever just told him a story. Sivan's expression shifted in a way that I couldn't quite read. The prince receives cultural narratives as part of his historical curriculum, he said. That's not what I mean, I said. I mean a story with no lesson. A stupid, honest, human story that goes nowhere in particular and just happens to be true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, the prince is the heir to an empire. His time is measured and allocated for maximum developmental return. Yes, I said. And it isn't working. He didn't have an answer for that. He dismissed me with the kind of formal politeness that is also a warning. I went back to my kitchen. I kept my door open. The moment that changed everything happened on the 16th night. Valith was watching me prep the morning spice blend when he asked why humans used fire, actual, open flame, in cooking, when there were more precise and controllable heating methods available. It was a perfectly logical question. I had a perfectly logical answer ready, about flavor compounds and the chemical reactions that only happen above certain temperatures, through direct application of combustion heat. I didn't give that answer. Instead, I told him about my grandmother. She had a kitchen in Accra, I told him. A small room with one window that looked out at the neighbor's mango tree. She cooked jollof rice, a rice dish, I explained, with tomatoes and peppers and an argument's worth of spices, and she cooked it on an open flame, and the most important part was the bottom, the very bottom of the pot, where the rice caught against the heat and burned just slightly, just enough to develop a crust with a smoky depth that you could not fake, could not reproduce, could not get any other way. She burned it on purpose. The whole neighborhood knew to come when they smelled that specific smell. People knocked on her door uninvited. She always had enough. She died before I was old enough to ask her how she did it. I told him that too. I didn't soften it. I said she died, and I didn't have the recipe. And I spent 2 years after that cooking jollof rice badly, repeatedly, adjusting and failing and adjusting again, trying to reconstruct from memory and from the particular shape of a feeling, the thing that she had always known, without thinking about it. The kitchen was very quiet. Valith said, "You lost the information." "Yes," I said, "and the source could not be recovered." "No." He was still for a long moment. Then he said, "And instead of abandoning the project, you rebuilt it from the incomplete data you retained." "I wouldn't call it a project," I said. "What would you call it?" I thought about it for a moment. "Love," I said. "We have a different word for it, but that's what it is. trying to keep something alive that doesn't want to stay dead. He sat with that in a way that I had learned meant he was not going to speak for a while. The clock moved, the ventilation hummed. Then he said, very quietly, I have never been permitted to lose anything. I didn't say that I was sorry. I didn't say that it would be all right. Those things were probably true, but they weren't what he needed right then. What I said was, do you want to learn the recipe? He looked at me. The rice. All of it, I said. Including the part where you get it wrong. He said yes. What happened next happened slowly. The way real things tend to happen. Velith began to ask questions that were different from before. Not the efficient, targeted questions of someone working through a curriculum, but the wandering, hungry questions of someone who had discovered that knowledge could be interesting rather than mandatory. He asked about the geography of West Africa, then about migration patterns and why people moved and what they carried with them and what they left behind. He asked about music and whether it served a communicative function or an emotional one, and I said probably both. And he said he had not previously considered that a thing could serve two functions simultaneously without one of those functions being primary. I said that most of the best things worked that way. He started appearing in the kitchen in daylight hours too. Not always. He still had his tutors, his sessions, his structured developmental schedule. But sometimes, in the gap between one obligation and the next, he would show up, not saying much, helping with tasks that were clearly below the attention of a crown prince, and apparently exactly what he needed. Commander Thesic noticed. Thesic noticed everything. It was her function. She came to find me one afternoon and stood in my kitchen doorway with the look of someone who had prepared a speech and was reconsidering it. Whatever you're doing, she said finally, his responsiveness metrics have improved by 31%. I'm making rice, I said. She was quiet for a moment. His tutors have filed a formal concern with the Emperor. I expected that. You should know, she said, and her voice was careful, that I filed a counter-report. I looked at her. She looked back at me, with an expression that I was fairly certain was the Vatharan equivalent of having decided something. Thank you, I said. She nodded once and left. The Emperor's ruling came through the ship's administrative system the following morning. Archtutor Savon was to be reassigned to a cultural advisory position on a diplomatic station, a move that everyone on the ship understood to mean something, even if no official communication said so directly. The cook was to remain in her current role indefinitely. The prince was to be permitted reasonable access to the lower decks as part of an expanded experiential curriculum. I read the message twice. Then I went back to the stove. That evening, Velith arrived at 1800 ship time, early, and with the particular focused expression he got when he had decided to take something seriously. He stood at the second counter, where I had laid out the ingredients, and said, I want to try again. Third attempt, I said. You got the spices right last time. Focus on the flame. He nodded. He measured the oil. He got the pan hot the way I had shown him. He added the ingredients in the right order, with the right timing. And when the rice had been cooking long enough that the bottom was approaching the critical point, that specific moment that my grandmother had known by smell and sound, and some sense I don't have a name for, he reached over and adjusted the flame himself. Not because I told him to, because he knew. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Sometimes that is how you know you've actually taught someone something. Not when they repeat the lesson back to you correctly, but when they forget you were ever the one teaching, and do the thing because it is now simply part of who they are. The rice was almost right. The crust at the bottom had that particular depth, that smokiness that you cannot fake or shortcut or reproduce with any more precise or efficient method. We ate it standing up because there was nowhere to sit in my kitchen, and because neither of us was the kind of person who waits for the right moment when there is good food getting cold. He didn't say it was good. Vetharans don't do that. But he finished his bowl first, and then he reached for more.